For many of you that's going to be considering joining a startup, you may be offered stock options. And I'd like to talk about some things that you should think about when it comes to receiving stock options as part of your entire compensation plan. Stock options will be terrific in order to give you an upside with the corporation. As long as the corporation starts to grow and do extremely well, then you'll be able to share in that upside as well. Many of you are familiar with companies like Facebook, Apple, and Google, who've taken their initial and all sorts of employees and turned them into millionaires through stock options. Now, when you receive an offer to join a company and receive it as part of your compensation package, stock options, these are some of the questions you should be asking as part of the package. What percentage of the company do these stock options offered represent? This is perhaps the single most important question. When it comes to options, obviously a larger number of options is better than a smaller number, but percentage ownership is what really matters. For instance, if a company offers 100,000 options, but there's already 100 million shares outstanding, then your actual percentage ownership would be less than a company which may offer you 10,000 options, but only have 1 million shares outstanding. The second offer, even though the second offer is 10,000 options instead of 100,000 options, the second offer is actually 10 times more attractive because you're getting a larger percentage of the company in the second example than you would be through the first example. So again, once you actually receive the stock option package, it's important that you ask what's the total number of shares outstanding and therefore determine what your percentage of ownership of the company your options represent. When you actually ask about the number of total shares, you should make sure that they factor in all of the options or all of the shares on what's called a fully diluted basis. Fully diluted basis means you're not just talking about all the outstanding shares of the company, but also all shares, options, warrants, any other convertible equity into shares that the company represents. This is important because the outstanding number of shares of a growth company may be, let's say, 1 million shares, but there may be a lot of preferred shares, there may be existing options, there may be warrants to various investors, which may swell up that number to 2 million or 3 million. So it's very important that when you're asking how many shares are being factored into your percentage ownership calculation, that they tell you the number on a completely fully diluted basis. Next, what is the typical market rate for your position? Every job's going to have a typical market rate and salary and also equity. You should determine what would be the typical market rate to figure out if you're getting a fair stock option plan. Next, what is your vesting schedule? Every stock option will have a vesting schedule, which means your option will not be exercisable. You cannot actually receive the underlying shares that your option represents until you've worked a certain period of time. Typically, this may mean that after 1 year of service, this may be over an entire 4-year period before all the options will become completely exercisable. A typical vesting schedule will look like after 1 year, 25% will be exercisable, and then the other 75% will be exercisable based on each month of employment after year 1 all the way through year 4. That would be a typical vesting schedule, but you should ask what the vesting schedule for your options would be. Will it be over a 4-year period? Will it be longer, over a 5-year period? Will it be time-based vesting, or will there be some performance requirements before vesting will apply as well? Next, you should ask, what happens to my vested shares if I leave before the vesting schedule has been completed? Typically, if you should leave your employment, you would have some period of time, perhaps 90 days or so, before you would be able to, or when you can exercise your options for the vested portion, even if you've left the company. However, at some companies that there may be a much shorter period of time or no time at all. You should determine this in advance and make sure you understand your rights after termination of your employment as to what happens to your stock option. Do they allow for early exercise of stock options? Allowing employees to exercise their stock options before they have vested can have a certain tax benefit to their employees. You should discuss this option or discuss this possibility with your employer as part of your option package. Next, will there be any acceleration of your vesting if the company is acquired? Let's say you work at a company for 2 years and then it gets acquired. You may have joined the private company because you didn't want to work for a big company. If so, you may want some mechanism of vesting acceleration, or in other words, all of your unvested equity accelerates in its vesting so that all of your stock options becomes fully vested upon the actual acquisition event. This would also be a mechanism by which you would be able to gain liquidity, because the sale of the business, of the company, may typically be a liquidity event for a lot of your members, the existing shareholders of the company, the founders and the investors, for instance, and so you may want to share in that upside. Many companies would typically allow for an additional 6 months of vesting upon an acquisition if you're fired. That would be something which you may also want to discuss with them as well. Next, are the options priced at fair market value determined by an independent appraiser? That would be something which you provide an assurance that your fair market value and which will be determining your exercise price is indeed truly a fair market value price. Next, what was the last round of financing which the company had valued itself at? That value would tell the context for how valuable your stock options may typically be. Common stock is typically not worth as much as preferred stock, and preferred stock is usually the stock which investors will purchase interests in the company. The price at which preferred stock is sold may, however, give you some insight into what the founders and investors would perceive the company's value to ultimately be. Next, how long would the current funding of the company last? That'll give you some sense into the health of the company overall. And lastly, you'd want to know how much the company has raised in the past. Now, this may seem counterintuitive, but there's a lot of instances where you may be worse off in a company that's raised a lot of money versus a little. This is the issue of liquidity preference. Liquidity preference is a preference that the investors have prior to in a sale of the business, prior to the founders receiving any value or the optionees receiving any value. This indicates how much the company must ultimately sell itself for before the optionees will have any sort of value altogether. So that provides some sort of practical considerations for you when you, as a prospective person, may be thinking about joining a startup.